And this is after the fact of all of the births that Jacob enjoyed as a result of his union with not only Leah and Rachel, but the eventual concubines who were the maids, Bilhah and Zilpah. So through these four women, Jacob now has 11 sons and one daughter. 6 of these sons and the daughter came through Leah. 4 sons came through the maids, now concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. And finally, the last son, Joseph, comes through Rachel. So as we will learn in our passage today, the birth of Joseph is very important. It not only comes at the end of this 7-year period, but it's also very important in a way I'm going to explain in just a moment. So if you remember from Genesis 28, the theophany, where God had this personal encounter with God, God repeated the covenant promises to Jacob, just as he had repeated them to Isaac, just as he had originally given them to Abraham, and that is the promise of land and descendants and a blessing to all the families of the earth. None of the patriarchs ever realized the inheritance of the land. That would not come until Joshua and then eventually David. But now Jacob has the descendants that neither Isaac or Abraham really have. Each of them only had the one child. Jacob now has 11 sons and will later on have the 12th son, Benjamin, through Rachel. But God had also promised Jacob during that theophany that he would be with him, that he would keep him, and that he would be with him wherever he went and would one day bring him back to his home, which was in Canaan. So Jacob has now served Laban for 14 years, and all he has to show for it are these 4 women and these 12 children, which is a lot. But Jacob has no material goods of any kind. That becomes the focus of our passage here today, where Jacob prospers. So our passage of study is going to be from Genesis 30, verses 25 all the way to 43, and it is broken up into 2 main sections. It'll be 25 to 34, and then verses 35 through 43. So to keep this together, we're going to read 25 to 34 first, and then we're going to look at 35 to 43 separately. So we'll look at those sections individually. I'm going to read 25 to 34 first, and that takes a little bit more breaking down than the second section does. So follow along with me if you will. Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart. For you yourself know my service which I have rendered to you." But Laban said to him, "If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account." He continued, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." But he said to him, "You yourself know that I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you have had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" So he said, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep and every black one among the lambs and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come concerning my wages. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be according to your word." Now that is the first section, and the first thing that we're going to see in this first section is Jacob and Laban agree to terms. So paramount to Jacob, the most important thing is the return back home, that Jacob could go back to Canaan, to where Isaac and his mother Rebekah are. He's been away for 14 years, and as we learn, his time with Laban has been fulfilled. He has worked off the 14-year obligation, that 14-year dowry that was required in order to marry his beloved Rachel. So the first thing that we see here, letter A, is Jacob seeks his release. Again, verse 25, it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country." So the repeating of Joseph's birth to Rachel is important because she is no longer barren, and the birth makes her bound to Jacob. So scholars surmise that if Jacob wanted to leave and if Laban was going to let him go, and that if Rachel had not borne him a child, then Laban could have reclaimed his daughter because she had not borne him any children. It's wrapped up in ancient culture, and although it can't be verified in this part of Genesis, this is what scholars have surmised from what they know about ancient from ancient cultures. But because Rachel has now borne a child to Jacob, she is now bound to him. So this is one of the things that is wrapped up into the importance of Joseph being born to Rachel as a part of the end of this second 7-year period. So in ancient times, an indentured servant, which Jacob is to Laban, when an indentured servant is then sent away, he would typically be sent away with a liberal supply of grain and wine and some amount of animal flock or herd, presumably to get a new start on life. They have served faithfully for whatever amount of time they were there, and now to allow them to get a new start on life, they would send them away so that they could get a leg up on life. Now, Jacob has been with Laban for 14 years. He wants to leave. And so what is wrapped up in Jacob's request to leave is the expectation that Laban is going to send Jacob away with something along the lines of what an indentured servant could expect. Laban, send me away with some of the things that an indentured servant would expect after serving you faithfully for 14 years. So how much more would this sending away be true for a flesh and blood relative who had faithfully served for 14 years and had married his 2 daughters and now had 12 children to care for? So we see again the sense of desperation that Jacob has in this request. Just as he had at the end of the first 7-year period of service, when he said to Laban, "Give me my wife," he says again in verse 26, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart from you yourself, know my service which I have rendered to you." So again, the word "give me" in the Hebrew conveys that passionate, desperate plea. And here he is asking that Laban let him depart. So that desperate, passionate plea communicates that Laban has been a taskmaster, that Jacob has not enjoyed the 14 years of work, even though he loved Rachel. Now he has these 12 children. He desperately wants to get away from Laban, but he has to ask permission to leave. There's 2 things to note here in the request that Jacob makes here in verse 26. The first thing to note is the word serve is used 3 times, depending upon your translation. In the NASB, it is served, it is service, and then it is rendered. Whatever words your translation uses, that word is used 3 times to communicate the relationship that exists between Laban and Jacob. It underscores the nature of their relationship. It is not uncle and nephew. It is employer and employee. That leads us to the second thing that is of note here. Technically, Laban and Jacob enjoy the relationship of employee and employer, which means, in a technical sense, Jacob is under contract, and Laban needs to grant Jacob his release, or else Laban could accuse Jacob of stealing the girls and the children away from Laban's household. We'll see more of this in the next section that we get at in chapter 31. This reality causes Jacob to make this desperate plea. I've served you for 14 years. It's not been a lot of fun. I want to go away as an indentured employee who has fulfilled my time. I want you to send me away as you would an indentured servant with some goods. And I have fulfilled my contract, so I am asking you to release me and to not accuse me of stealing anything from you when I go away. Letter B, Laban makes an offer. Verses 27 and 28. Laban said to him, "If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account." He continued, "Name your wages and I will give it." Laban basically totally disregards the desperate, passionate plea that Jacob makes. He has no interest in letting Jacob go. He's far too valuable for him. And so he plays up to Jacob, even saying that in his wise religious deduction, he's been able to surmise that God has blessed him on account of Jacob. He then makes the magnanimous offer to allow Jacob to name his price. Jacob, whatever you ask, I am going to give it. Now, it would be pretty comical, and I would imagine that it would take all of Jacob's composure to not laugh out loud at such an offer from Laban, because very, very fresh in Jacob's mind was the fact that when Jacob made the first agreement with Laban for the promise to marry Rachel, he switched the two daughters, and he in fact married Leah, not Rachel. So there's no way that Jacob for a minute would ever believe that Laban would live up to whatever agreement they would make when Laban says, "Name your price and I will give it." So Jacob is not about to allow Laban to trick him again. So letter C, Jacob just refuses the first offer that Laban makes to him. Verses 29 and 30. But he, Jacob, said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you," again serve, "and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turn. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" So Jacob agrees with Laban that God has indeed blessed Laban with an abundance, and he also makes the connection between Jacob's work and God's blessing. If you look at the quote there, "And the Lord blessed you wherever I turned." And so Jacob takes credit for the blessing of the Lord. He's not taking credit for what has happened. He's making it very clear that God has blessed you, Laban, not because of you, Laban, but God has blessed you, Laban, because of me, Jacob, because I belong to the Lord. The blessing that you have received, Laban, has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the fact that I belong to the Lord. So Jacob does want to make that very, very clear. Jacob isn't taking credit for the abundance of Laban's growth, but he is deflecting that growth to the Lord and to Jacob's belonging to the Lord. But the question remains, how is Jacob going to provide for his own household and the 4 women, 2 wives and 2 concubines, and the 12 children as an indentured employee? Because wages and service always mean an employee under contract, and that is not what Jacob is interested in at all. That brings us to the second point here under this first section. Laban is going to accept Jacob's offer. At this point, Jacob has gained the upper hand, and although Laban knows that, he's not just going to roll over. Letter A, Laban makes an offer. This is a counter offer, and we see this in verse 31a, the very first part of that. So he, Laban, said, "What shall I give you?" So Laban is vulnerable at this point, but this assumes that Laban is an honest man and that he will live up to the terms of whatever agreement is made as a result of this counter offer. So we must believe, as the reader, that in the back of Laban's mind, he has no interest in keeping the terms of the agreement, just as he failed to keep the terms of the first agreement and allowing Jacob to marry Rachel when he in fact switched the daughters and Rachel ended up being hidden somewhere and Jacob married Leah. So letter B, Jacob makes a counter offer. 31b, Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flocks." So this is important. In no way does Jacob want Laban to take any credit for what Jacob gains. He doesn't want Laban to be able to say, "Look what I did for Jacob," or "Look how generous I was." And so now we are going to see Jacob's plan. This is found in verses 32 and 33. Let's read this again. "Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, and when you come concerning my wages, everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen." So what you and I don't necessarily understand as not being pastoralists, not raising sheep and goats, is this. Most sheep are all white, and most goats are all one dark color, mostly brown or black. Spotted and striped sheep and goats are relatively rare, and incredibly, Jacob offered to remove the very few multicolored animals from Laban's flock as his compensation, and then he was going to shepherd the plain colored animals for Laban. So when these normally colored animals bred, the normal colored animals would remain Laban's, and the rare multicolored animals would then belong to Jacob. So from every angle, when Laban considered Jacob's plan, it was a great deal for Laban, because the likelihood of these normally colored animals breeding the oddly colored animals was incredibly rare. So this sounds like a very, very strange plan, doesn't it? So why would Jacob make that offer? Well, there's more to the story. And in order for us to understand the story, we got to jump forward to chapter 31 and figure out why Jacob made this plan. So we're going to jump forward to Genesis 31, verses 10 through 13. I have the verses for you on the screen. So as we jump forward, what we're going to find is Jacob is going to explain the plan to Rachel and Leah. He's going to call them out to the field to explain what is about to happen. And he explains this to them at the end of a 6-year period where Jacob has been tending the flocks for Laban, and the flocks that Jacob now owns has just exploded. Here's the rationale. And it came about, this is Jacob speaking, and it came about at the time when the flock were mating that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. He said, lift up now your eyes and see that all the male goats which are mating are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. So this dream is what prompts Jacob to begin making preparation to leave, and it is God's plan for Jacob to prosper from Laban's flock. Now, this appearance from the angel in this dream, in this trance, when Jacob sees the sheep and the goats mating, is before the explosion of the flock. Jacob sees this dreamlike trance thing happening, and this is what causes Jacob to begin making plans to leave, and this is God's plan for Jacob to benefit on behalf of Laban's flock. This is the plan that Jacob presents to Laban, and Laban says, that's a great plan, Jacob. I agree. So Laban says internally, you are going to take care of all of the normally colored animals, and you are only going to get to keep the oddly colored animals that are the result of the normally colored animals mating. I agree. But what Laban doesn't know is that God has spoken to Jacob saying, I got this. I'm going to do something that can only be explained by me, and I am going to make sure that when you leave, you're going to have all that you need and much, much more. Verse 34, Laban said, good, let it be according to your word. So by Laban's account, Jacob's wages are going to be minimal because the likelihood that normally colored animals are going to breed oddly colored animals is very, very rare. So Laban thinks that Jacob's wages are going to be minimal, but Laban doesn't know that God has a plan. This takes us to the second section here, which is 35 through 43, and this is going to go very, very quickly. Number 3 in the outline, Jacob outwits Laban. So after the negotiations are complete, each man makes his preparations, and right out of the gate, true to form, Laban cheats Jacob. Verses 35 and 36. So he, Laban, removed on that day the striped and spotted male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, and every one with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep, and gave them into the care of his sons. And he put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So before even a single day passes, Laban has already broken the agreement. The agreement was that Jacob was to separate the oddly colored animals, and Laban does this and gives these animals to the care of his sons, and he sends his sons with these animals on a 3-day journey to separate them from the flock that Jacob is now going to care for. And Jacob is caring for the normally colored animals, the herd that belongs to Laban. So Jacob begins taking care of the normally colored animals, making the growth of his personal herd all the more miraculous. So Jacob has no oddly colored animals of his own to breed. He only has Jacob has no oddly colored animals to breed on his own. He only has the normally colored animals of Laban's by which to produce oddly colored animals that will become his down the road. Letter B, Jacob outsmarts Laban. So this is a little bit of a miswording because it's really not about Jacob outsmarting Laban. It's more about God doing for Jacob what he really couldn't do for himself. But based upon what is in the passage, Jacob outsmarts Laban. So there's two parts to this plan here, the first of which is the multicolored branches. Now, if you've been a fastidious student and read ahead, you're going to say, what does all of this mean? So we're going to read verses 37 all the way down to 40, and then I'm going to explain this to you. 37, then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the gutters, even in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban, and he put his own herds apart. It did not put them with Laban's flock. So what does all that mean? Well, Jacob took some branches from these different types of trees, and he peeled the bark from them and made white stripes in these branches or in these rods. And he laid these rods around the edges of the area that the flocks would roam and around the watering troughs. And all of this is rooted in superstitious myth that if the normally colored animals saw these striped rods, it would cause them to produce spotted and speckled animals. That was Jacob's thinking. I know what I'll do. I'll peel the bark off of these trees. The animals are going to see these striped trees, and that's going to cause them to produce oddly colored animals. That was Jacob's plan. So just as Rachel thought the mandrakes from the previous passage were going to help her overcome her barrenness, Jacob thought the multicolored branches were going to help the normally colored animals produce the oddly colored animals that was going to grow his own personal herd. It's a good plan that Jacob had, right? So the superstition was that as long as these animals could see these striped branches while they mated, they would produce these oddly colored animals. He believed this even though God had spoken to him in Genesis 31 about the plan. Jacob felt that it was necessary for him to enact this plan rooted in this superstitious fable. Jacob thought God needed his help, even though God spoke to him in a dream. It's like Jacob just will never, ever get it. Jacob's faith is always going to be slow to develop until we get to this monumental episode in Jacob's life. So on the one hand, Jacob has the assurance of God that this plan of God's is going to make him prosperous. But on the other hand, he felt it was still necessary to employ this superstitious practice to accomplish what God had already promised was going to become true. So the second way that Jacob outsmarts Laban is in these, got one out of there, letter B didn't show up. Number 2 there is shrewd breeding practices. So there is some accuracy in the shrewd breeding practices within modern animal husbandry. And that is, you take strong animals and you breed them with other strong animals. And this is what Jacob does here in verses 41 and 42. Moreover, whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the side of the flock in the gutter so that they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Now again, Jacob employed the usage of the striped rods, thinking that that was again going to create the oddly colored animals. That had nothing to do with it. But breeding strong animals with strong animals will create strong animals. And so that is a shrewd breeding practice. But again, the striped branches had nothing to do with Jacob creating the oddly colored animals which would grow Jacob's flock. The true results of the growth of Jacob's flock had nothing to do with him employing the superstitious practice. It was the work of our sovereign God, who promised to be with Jacob, to keep him, and to protect him, and then also promised to bless him through Laban's flock. So as we learn in the next section, Jacob is going to employ this practice for 6 years and then breed these animals successfully under the gracious plan of God, so that Jacob would then go back to his homeland and prosper. And the obvious results are there for us. Jacob prospered in verse 43. So the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So the verb there, exceedingly, I'm not sure what your translation has, but the verb exceedingly in the Hebrew means to break out. It's like an explosion of growth, one that would exceed what would normally be expected, not only in the number of oddly colored animals, but in the number of animals that would be bred in a 6-year period. Jacob prospered so much from the flocks under God's gracious plan that he was able to sell some of these animals and acquire servants and camels and donkeys. That was how much Jacob was able to prosper under God's gracious plan. So the promise that God made to Jacob all the way back at this appearance in Bethel, to be with him and to keep him, has been fulfilled. God is always, always true to his promises. So as we think about this, Rachel and Jacob are two of the same kind. They both tarnish their faith with superstitious practice. Rachel with the mandrakes and Jacob with these striped rods, thinking that God needs their help to accomplish his promise. But Jacob is more at fault, having had this personal encounter with God, not only at Bethel, but also in the field when God spoke to him in this dream. But our gracious God blesses them beyond their faith, Rachel with the child Joseph, and eventually with Benjamin, and Joseph with an abundance of flocks, and eventually these material goods. It is a testament to God's commitment to fulfill his promises despite the flawed vessels they get fulfilled through. I want you to think about that. God is faithful to fulfill his promises despite the flawed vessels they get fulfilled through. One commentator writes this: God is not frustrated by the cheat, which would be Laban. Justice will finally be done, and his promises to his people of land, protection, and blessing to the nations will, despite all opposition, eventually triumph. We should never forget that. As difficult as difficult as it is, living out our faith in this world, God is faithful to his promises, and despite all opposition, will eventually triumph. This has little to do with the people involved, but it has everything to do with the God that they and we serve, and we should never, ever forget that. Would you bow with me in prayer, please? Father, we give you thanks for another reminder of just how good and faithful you are to fulfill your promises to your people. And we, like Jacob, still believe you need our help. And I pray that we would remember that you are always faithful to fulfill your promises. And as flawed